be empirically effective, so it would have to be a law that works, right? It has to be a law that will be politically popular or politically appealable, a law that could pass, and then it has to be constitutional. It has to satisfy the Second Amendment. So that kind of we think of it as a Venn diagram when we're thinking about these issues, that it's got to satisfy all three of those factors in order to be a law that we'd want to see passed. So I'm going to focus mostly on this constitutional bubble because oftentimes that's a barrier to what often can be effective or even politically popular proposals, but happy to address any of the other kind of aspects, although again, some of those issues are outside of my expertise. So I'm at the Center for Firearms Law at Duke, and one of the things that I need to say at the beginning is that I'm not here talking on behalf of Duke. I'm here talking in my individual capacity, but most of what I'm going to say is going to be consistent with the center's mission, which is that we are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization, and we're just interested in helping further this debate around the Second Amendment and firearms law. So one point of context, and then again, I'm not going to speak for very long. I want to answer any questions and help be part of this discussion as much as I can. But one thing that's important is what the Second Amendment actually does, right? So it's 27 words. It says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It's ratified in 1791, along with the rest of the Bill of Rights, but it wasn't until 2008, so 217-year gap there, until the United States Supreme Court actually said that it doesn't actually have anything to do with a militia, or at least it doesn't have anything in our modern world of gun regulations to do with a militia. What it actually has to do with, the court said, was self-defense and protecting yourself from criminal threats and other kinds of threats. And so what the court said in 2008 in that decision was that it protects your right to have a handgun in your home for purposes of self-defense. Now, you can read into the tea leaves there and say that it protects a lot of other stuff, but that's what the court said in 2008. And yet in that same decision, the court said that doesn't mean that all gun regulation is off the table. The court explicitly said the Second Amendment, like other rights, is not absolute. And it listed some policies there that could be enacted consistent with the Second Amendment, or at least that its decision was not calling into question. And a lot of the debates in the years since then, the court hasn't done much with the Second Amendment since that 2008 decision, have been about what laws are going to be consistent with the Second Amendment, which laws the Second Amendment allows. And most of the challenges that have cropped up in the years since then have upheld different gun laws around the country. And one of the reasons for that is that there just have not historically and traditionally, especially in modern times, been a lot of stringent gun regulations, because oftentimes it's the politics that keeps those laws from happening in the first place, not the Second Amendment that's being a restriction on the laws that are passed. I'll say just one more brief thing before I open up to any questions that folks might have. But that's that there's this misconception when we're looking at history in the Second Amendment that we traditionally didn't have any regulations on guns, and that traditionally this was just an unfettered right, and regulation is modern. And that's just not accurate. There have been regulations on firearms throughout American history. And in fact, early in the Republic, there were some stricter regulations than we even have currently. So gun regulation has always been a part of our history. On the other hand, it's also certainly true that gun rights have always been a part of our tradition. It's never been either or. Are you for the Second Amendment or are you for gun regulation? Always throughout American history, it's been both. There's been regulation and there's been rights, and that's certainly something that gets lost in a lot of the public conversation around the Second Amendment. So that's maybe all I'll say, unless there are specific issues that Steve you'd like me to chat about, or happy to also address any questions. Oh, you're muted.
What a rookie mistake. I know that the questions exist because I've already heard people talking about having them, but no one's put any questions in the chat just yet. So I would like to start with one that I think would be helpful for our modern mind is, what is a militia? What constitutes a militia?
So at the time of the founding, when the Second Amendment was ratified, state militias were the primary means of internal and external security, and they consisted of free white men, mostly. Some had property requirements, mostly free white men, ages ranging in 16 to 18, starting all the way up to 45 to 55. And so that was the police force, that was the military, in a time when the founding fathers were particularly concerned about a standing army, the kind of military that we currently have, because they thought a standing army, a permanent military comprised of professionals and not citizen soldiers would be a threat to the people's liberty. And so that was what the conception of a militia was at the time. The Constitution makes the militia answerable and can be called up into federal service. And so that was one of the things that was on the minds of those who proposed the Second Amendment, that they wanted to ensure that the federal government, now that it had permission by the Constitution to call up the militia, wasn't going to disarm it.
We've got a question here. Were the stricter regulations, were they federal or state?
Mostly state. So the federal government, other than there were militia acts early in our history at the federal level that required individuals to acquire certain types of weapons and appear for training and to have their weapons inspected. Most of the regulations throughout history for firearms have been at the state and local level and not at the federal level.
Rich is asking a question, and I think we'll probably get into more of this toward the end, but other than writing to our senators, calling them, what can we do to help make change?
Yeah, so I kind of put together a list of a couple organizations that do work in this space, a couple of local ones and a couple of national ones. Now, these are organizations that are interested in gun violence prevention work, and so they're in favor of stricter regulations over guns. If that's not something you're interested in, there are other organizations that that you could work with, but these are organizations that do that kind of work. And so I can either screen share, I can send that to you, Steve. There's just a list of a couple organizations, but that kind of activity showing up to places is really effective. One of the things that we see in the gun rights movement that has been really, really effective is that starting around the 1970s is when the NRA, the National Rifle Association, started changing its public outlook and its public advocacy. There was a national convention in the late 1970s. It's often called the Revolt at Cincinnati, where hardliners in the organization took over leadership from those that they considered insufficiently against all forms of gun regulation. And so since then, what we see, and some political scientists have tracked this, is that the NRA has been intentionally creating a gun rights ideology. So an ideology around gun rights is something that needs protecting, and a gun owner identity. So making those who own guns feel that their identity can be found at least partly in guns. And it's really effective in the way that a lot of gun rights proponents and gun owners are single issue voters, that they show up to the polls, that they call their elected representatives, that they go to city council meetings, that they write letters to the editor and letters to their representatives when gun regulations are being proposed. And so that's something that traditionally the proponents of stricter regulation, what's often called the GVP or gun violence prevention movement, has not had as much of. We did start to see a change after the Sandy Hook shootings in 2012. That's when a whole bunch of organizations expanded their efforts, and now there are local chapters of organizations like Moms Demand Action. There are Students Demand Action organizations. So there are more grassroots on that side, but traditionally for those left of center, gun regulations have been something that they will report to pollsters that they're interested in, but that they're not single issue voters on. There's not a high intensity of their preferences there. Whereas right of center folks, a lot of them have really high intensity for disliking gun regulations, and they show up to things.
And that dislike for that, it's gosh, I don't mean to sound too reductive or stereotypical, but it seems like a programmed dislike. I can't imagine how we would come up with that on our own, unless to have been told that issue was going, that was the end of civilization as we knew it. Back to your ideology point, it's so ingrained to think that way, but it's downloaded. We're not coming up with that ourselves. It doesn't seem.
Yeah, I think that's right. That there is there's a real resonance to the arguments that every regulation is a slippery slope to confiscation. And that confiscation is going to lead to tyranny, and that tyranny is going to lead to extinction of civilization. Yeah.
Got a question from a teacher, and this may be outside your purview, but I'd still love you to respond to it. What do you think the reality or likelihood is that the notion about the notion of teachers being armed in the classroom?
Yeah, so I could talk a little bit about it. A couple of things that we know is that trained law enforcement are not very accurate shots under pressure. So something like 18% of shots fired by officers hit their targets in stressful, high impact situations. And so if the proposal is to train and arm teachers with less than the kind of training that law enforcement has, which is not always the case. I think it's Nevada or one of the states that has an opt-in program for teachers if they pass the same requirements that law enforcement do. But if the requirements are less than that for law enforcement, I think we can expect less accuracy. Another concern is that we know teachers are already overworked and underpaid, and so adding additional responsibilities is really a lot of work and a lot of task of teachers. There are also a lot of collective bargaining issues that arise in teachers' unions when the discussions turn to arming teachers, whether it's going to be a condition of employment, whether there's going to be additional benefits provided for that, whether negligent discharge or negligent storing of weapons can be grounds for dismissal, even though it's not directly teaching related. So a lot of issues come up there. And then obviously there are liability issues that arise there as well. As a matter of policy, those are issues to debate. But I think, the shooting in Texas, where we saw that there were lots of armed people around the situation and were willing to intervene in quick succession, I think doesn't make it seem like having armed teachers around is going to be, the solution that some are hoping.
For any officers that have joined us today, I'll speak for my own experience and my dad being an officer for 25 years. It was routine multiple times a year, staying proficient on a firearm because it was your job, and still, it's something that when it matters most is incredibly dangerous and incredibly fraught, and the inaccuracies and all that. And it grieves me to think of teachers being held to some sort of standard that's going to, to move them into that space to protect lives that way. And then take lives. It just sounds like a fantasy to me. So I definitely have strong opinions there. I've got a couple other questions. Let me comb through them quickly. What is the reality regarding the proposal that passed Congress and is bogged down in the Senate in terms of real impact to limiting folks' access to firearms? Are their arguments legitimate?
So there are kind of three pieces of legislation that are being talked about right now. I think only two of them, but maybe three of them have passed the House and not the Senate. So one of them is often called universal background checks, or it's just expanding the background check system. And what this would do is federal law regulates all gun purchases in the United States that are with guns that are shipped in interstate commerce, which is most firearms. But the federal background check system only requires a background check to be performed if a person buys their gun from a gun dealer, a federally licensed dealer. And not everybody who sells guns is required to get a license to do so. So this is often called the gun show loophole, because a lot of unlicensed dealers will sell guns at gun shows, but it's not really a gun show loophole. It's just really a private sale loophole. So if you're not a licensed dealer, I'm not a licensed dealer, I can sell you a gun, and I don't have to get a license to sell unless I'm meeting the threshold that's in the business of doing that for a living. And it's perfectly legal, and I don't have to do a background check, even in North Carolina, although North Carolina has different rules with handguns than with long guns.
What is the threshold? Sorry to interrupt. That seems important.
So yeah, so the threshold, so it is, there's not a number of guns sold. The statutory definition is someone who is in the business of selling firearms, and what the definition says essentially that you are in it for profit and that you are doing it as a means of livelihood. And so what this means is that a lot of casual sellers are not required to get a license and run a background check even when they do sales. So there are some proposals, not these ones I'm talking about now, but some proposals that say we should have just a quantitative limit. If you sell more than 50 guns a year, then you're a dealer, have to get a license. That's not the law. But this proposal to expand background checks would make it so that anytime there's a firearm transfer, so if I sell a gun to you, then I have to go to a gun dealer and run the background check before I can sell that gun to you. It exempts a couple of categories like familial transfers, sometimes temporary transfers. But other than that, they're fairly universal in their scope. And a couple of states do this. So California has a universal background check system where any kind of gun transfer other than those narrow categories has to have a background check performed. That's one of the ones that's being debated right now. It's got something like 70 to 90% of popular approval, depending on the survey that you look at. And it was one of the ones that almost passed after Sandy Hook in 2012, but didn't get the 60 votes needed to overcome a Senate filibuster. I think that one has some promise of passing, although the structural hurdles are still there. Another one is a little lesser known, but it has to do also with the background check system. It's closing what's often called the Charleston loophole because of the Charleston massacre. And that is that under current federal law, when you go to buy a gun from a gun store, they call up the FBI and do the background check. And if the background check is not, it's usually completed instantly. It's called the National Instant Background Check System. So usually they plug your name into a system, there's no red flag, and they say, okay, go ahead and sell the weapon to the person. If it doesn't happen instantly, then it gets into delayed status, and then the FBI does a deeper dive. And right now, under federal law, if the FBI doesn't complete that deeper dive in 3 business days, then the gun dealer can just go ahead and sell the gun to the person anyways, even without knowing whether or not they're actually prohibited from possessing that gun. And this is one of the reasons why it's called the Charleston loophole, is that Dylan Roof purchased his weapon from a gun dealer because the dealer sold the weapon after the FBI didn't get back to them in 3 business days. And so this law would expand the time period to 10 business days. And then the final piece, and sorry, I'm going on a lot here, but the final piece is what is often called extremist protection order laws or red flag laws. And these are laws that 19 states and DC have currently. And I think they're one of the most promising current proposals, both because they've shown some empirical effectiveness and because they tend to get bipartisan buy-in, or at least they have in the past. And what they do is they allow an individual, usually a family member or law enforcement, to go to court and petition to take someone else's firearms away for a temporary period of time, if they can show that the person is an imminent threat to themselves or to others. So these red flag laws have been used pretty substantially in Florida, which enacted it after the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting in 2018. And they've been enacted in other states, and they've been successful in those states as well. So that's the kind of last piece of the puzzle. And then obviously there are calls for age restrictions and restrictions on certain weapons, like what are often called assault weapons or large capacity magazines. And happy to talk about those too, but those are some of the things.
Great. Got some great questions coming in. But I'll say that anybody paying attention to you right now is probably panting. You're giving tons of really great information. So everybody know that I am recording this, and you can go back through this. If you missed something, we'll make the video available sometime real soon. And still have people joining us as well. Let me see. There was one question. You have touched on it a couple of times, but maybe if we really unpack it, because I think it's connected to our sense of for lack of a better term, our sense of hopefulness about getting involved in this. What would be a realistic goal for gun restriction laws? Presumably it would be difficult to legislate away all mass shootings. So what does success look like? That's a great question, Matt.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And a couple of things in response to it. One is, imagine that we had no Second Amendment. There's no chance that in the United States you're going to ban all guns, right? It's just not politically feasible. So that's off the table. Even if you said, look at every study that shows eliminating guns from society would make us safer, it's just never going to happen, and the Constitution is not the reason it's not going to happen. You're not going to have a handgun ban, even though handguns are the primary weapon that are used in most homicides and most gun assaults in the United States, more than long guns like assault weapons. Those were unpopular even before the Supreme Court said those were unconstitutional. So DC and Chicago had those laws, but voters in Massachusetts and California voted them down even before the Supreme Court said anything. So we're not going to have any sweeping kind of regulations. The Second Amendment stops that, and politics stops that. So what does success look like? I think it looks like targeted, different kinds of targeted regulations. And that gets at the point that when we're talking about the problem of gun violence, we're talking about at least 4 different problems. So there's not just one gun violence problem, as a collective whole. There's separate problems that each of them have separate different kinds of interventions that might help. So there is the problem of public mass shootings, like we saw recently, that are account for a small number of actual physical deaths each year from guns, but have huge outsized significance, and I think rightfully so, because the Washington Post did a study that said 300,000 kids have been exposed to gun violence in their schools since Columbine. So a small number who've actually died from gunshot wounds, but huge numbers of people who've been affected, and all of us who see it and hear about it and are affected, even if we weren't in school at the time. So mass shootings, huge problem. Another bucket of problems is intimate partner violence with firearms. So huge problem. I think the latest I saw, something like 1 million women in the United States report being shot or shot at by an intimate partner. It's one of the leading cause of death for women. If they're going to be murdered, they're most likely to be murdered by an intimate partner than by a stranger. So that's a huge different bucket of problems that have different kinds of solutions. Another one is gun suicides. So about 2/3 of gun deaths each year in the United States are gun suicides, not gun homicides. And so that is a different set of solutions. And then the other bucket, which accounts for a lot of the murders, are kind of inner city gun violence, and that has a different set of solutions than these other ones do. But kind of to get at the question, like, what does success look like? It looks like either reducing the number of mass shootings that happen each year, or reducing the severity in deaths that happen in those mass shootings for that bucket. And some of the laws that are proposed to help with that are assault weapons bans or bans on large capacity magazines. We had both of those bans in effect at the federal level from 1994 to 2004. There is, of course, as there is in everything in this area, a dispute among the economists and the folks who study the outcomes about what effect that had. I think some of the research is showing, at least, that where in places where there are bans on these high capacity magazines, that the number of people killed in mass shootings is less than when there are not those kind of restrictions on magazines. But again, that's contested. So I think targeted piecemeal legislation that gets at the concerns of each of those buckets is what success looks like.
Would you say, because we were getting some questions about the assault weapon ban in 1994. So I'm going to turn it into a 2-part question. One, it's not an overstatement to say that banning those weapons equals less mass murder. Or are you saying even that's disputed?
That's disputed. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that's disputed is because some think it didn't do anything at all, because what it did was ban certain weapons by name. So it said this model, this make of weapon is banned, and then it banned other kind of weapons by characteristics. So a center fire semi-automatic rifle with a detachable magazine that can hold more than 10 rounds and has a bayonet plug, right? So that might be a weapon that would be banned under the 1994 assault weapons ban. But because of the nature of the characteristics, manufacturers could just change components of those weapons and still sell legal weapons that would not fall into the statutory restrictions. And then also what the law did was it grandfathered in every weapon that was then existing in 1994. And so we saw a huge run on those weapons before the law went into effect in 1994. And so it didn't do anything about the weapons that were in existence.
So it makes me think that the AR-15 is kind of the favorite boogeyman in the last few years, and I think in part rightfully so. But is banning weapons like that? Do you get a sense? Does Jake get a sense that that's symbolic more than effective?
I have a hard time with that. Both because of whether symbolic means empty or if there's positive benefits to the symbolism. And also, I am not entirely sure of what the effects are when a lot of the ways that to write a statute that bans a certain weapon has to necessarily focus on characteristics that manufacturers can then change. So in California, which has an assault weapons ban, you can sell AR-15 compliant, California compliant ARs, right? You can sell very similar weapons that have, like almost essentially the same functionality as a weapon that you can get in Texas, except for that it can't be called an AR-15 because it's California.
Right. I'm combining some other questions on here too. Is there, how strong is the debate about taking a test, about being licensed, about, not just the background check as maybe we've talked about it, but I know there's other countries that do a full-on psych exam. How strong is the argument against those based on the interpretation of the Second Amendment?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on a couple of different factors. One would be whether or not it's a requirement to purchase a gun or whether it's a requirement to carry a gun in public. So I think those are going to matter to the courts that are looking at it. If it's, in some states have requirements that before you even purchase it. So those of you who have bought a weapon in North Carolina, that we have a handgun purchase permit. And so you have to go and get a permit to purchase a handgun. You have to go through a background check. And so those kind of laws can impose restrictions on people's purchasing ability. And there's, again, some empirical evidence there that shows that those laws can effectively reduce gun violence. And most of those laws have not been successfully challenged on Second Amendment grounds. Where states get into trouble with this prevailing interpretation of the Second Amendment is when they impose requirements that are discretionary in the hands of the licensing officials. So instead of saying, if you pass this background check and you do 10 hours of training, then you get your permit. If the state says to get this permit, you have to show good cause, you have to show a good reason that you fear for your life, that's different than just the fact that you want a gun for self-defense. That's where courts have said, that there's a disagreement among the courts, and there's a Supreme Court case right now that's pending. The court's going to decide it in about 3 weeks. But that case is about New York's requirement for getting a concealed carry permit for carrying in public. And it requires an individual to show what the statute says proper cause. And that's, the argument is that that's in the eye of the beholder. And that's not a standard that the Second Amendment allows a state to impose. But in terms of objective criteria like training requirements and background checks, so far those have not been successfully challenged on Second Amendment grounds.
Question just popped up. It's a really good one. What are the discussions and debates about regulating ammunition, which don't seem to be covered by the Second Amendment directly?
Yeah, so a couple of courts have said expressly that since guns don't work without ammunition, that ammunition is protected too. And I think that's a fair extension of what the Supreme Court is likely to say about ammunition. It doesn't mean that it has to be regulated the same way. You might be able to have more regulations on types of ammunition. Some states like California require a background check for ammunition purchases, but under federal law, if you buy a handgun or a long gun from a dealer, you have to go through a background check, but not for ammunition purchases. And for dealers who are selling only ammunition, they don't have to get a license to do so either. So it's just kind of a descriptive fact that ammunition is less regulated at the federal level and in most states than firearms. And that there probably is more room for both states and the federal government to regulate ammunition purchases. But so far, I think most of the focus has been on the weapons themselves and not the ammunition.
Okay. Some people that maybe have sent an email to their senators in the last couple of days have gotten a response where hey, thank you for writing us, and all of these are being read, and here's what we're doing. And right now, it seems like in this state, in North Carolina, all the emphasis is being put on enforcing laws that are already on the books. Yeah, that's what really they come down to, that we already have all the laws that we need in place. So how do we enforce those? How does that actually, how would enforcing the laws that we actually have help? And I say that, for a lot of reasons, for my own personal sense of hope again. But while we're talking, CNN has just put up a headline: "There's been another deadly shooting." While we're talking right now, there's been a deadly shooting, and it's not in North Carolina, but it's definitely happened in a state that has laws. So what is a legitimate conversation about all we need to do is enforce the laws that we have? How's that going to help?
Yeah. So you often hear this in response to a shooting that maybe would have been averted if the law, had been followed. So say somebody who is prohibited from possessing firearms, like a person with a felony conviction under federal law, they can't possess firearms. They somehow secure a weapon and they commit mass shooting, or just a normal shooting. Then the argument is, well, if we would just enforce the law that says that person can't have weapons, then we wouldn't have had this shooting. And for the most part, there's not a proactive enforcement of disarming the people who aren't allowed to have weapons. So there is no gun registry in the United States. We don't keep track of who has what weapons. So if somebody owns guns and they then get convicted of a felony, there's nobody going and checking whether or not they have guns in their homes and whether or not they gave away those guns because they can no longer possess them. Some states, and again, you're pointing to California because it has some of the strictest gun laws. California has as a dedicated law enforcement agency that is checking the databases of disqualifying factors like felony convictions, like domestic violence convictions, like domestic violence restraining orders, against what California has is a gun registration system. So who has guns and who has disqualifying factors, and they proactively go out and remove the guns from those individuals. So that's what one aspect of enforcing the laws we already have could look like. And yeah, I think mostly when folks are talking about, they're talking about laws about who can and can't possess firearms. And I'll just put in a point here about this enforcing the laws and about new laws, which is that, we're kind of also in the midst of an ongoing national conversation about mass incarceration and about the way the criminal justice system is disproportionately applied against communities and people of color. And so when there are these debates and there are calls for new gun regulations, they're increasingly met by skepticism, especially among those on the center left, about the way that those new laws are going to be enforced. So if you think about a law like stop and frisk, we know stop and frisk had really racially discriminatory impact. And yet the kind of impetus for stop and frisk was to get illegal guns off the street. So it was a gun violence prevention tactic that had really racially discriminatory impacts. And for some of the laws that are being proposed, I think it's fair to criticize them on the ground that it's giving law enforcement one more tool in which conscious or unconscious bias could end up leading to some really bad effects.
Mm-hmm. That's a whole other conversation too, separate but entirely connected, of how this this conversation changes based on zip codes, and rural and urban, and definitely race packed into all that. So that's probably worth coming back to on its own. So let's take this 18-year-old in Texas. Mm-hmm. Is there a way within our immediate lifetimes, is there a way that kid, that 18-year-old, doesn't have the capacity to buy several $1,000s worth of deadly weapons and ammunition?
Yeah, I think there is. After Parkland, Florida enacted a law raising the age to purchase long guns to 21 years old. Right, so Florida, not a state that is, anyone would accuse of being a gun grabbing state, and yet they enacted red flag laws. They enacted this law raising the age to purchase long guns to 21. Under federal law, dealers can't sell handguns to those who are under 21, and so I think that's it doesn't seem likely at the federal level changing this law. It wouldn't be surprising to see more states adopt these age restrictions, especially as we get new social science out about the ways that adolescent and young adult minds are still developing even into early 20s. And so they're not fully formed. And I think that when legislatures and courts look at that kind of evidence, they can see maybe it's not the best idea to allow anybody to walk into a store and buy these weapons. California has a law that doesn't allow 18 to 20-year-olds to purchase centerfire, semi-automatic weapons, or excuse me, rifles. One court just struck that down a few weeks ago as violating the Second Amendment. I don't think that decision is going to stand. I think another court's going to reverse it, but there are arguments that are pretty active out there that these laws are unconstitutional, but we do see kind of more support for them especially after instances like this where we see a lot of troubled young men with easy access to guns.
Are there states doing it better than others? I mean, John Whaling is asking this question and raises a great point that there's so much variety and restriction from state to state. Mm-hmm. Who are the states to look to that are at least relatively doing it well?
Yeah, so one point before that particular question, which is that when you look at what happens in state legislatures after a mass shooting, I think the kind of cynical response of many of us is that nothing happens, right? Mm-hmm. It's actually not true. It's actually, if you're in favor of gun regulation, it's actually much worse than that, in that we see after mass shootings, states with Republican-controlled legislatures tend to enact loosening of their gun laws, so relaxing their gun laws. States with Democratic-controlled legislatures tend not to do much. So they don't pass legislation, but red states pass legislation loosening gun laws. And so at the same time that we're having a discussion about what gun laws might work, what we've seen over the last 20 years is that many red states across the country have significantly loosened their gun laws way beyond what the Constitution would require. So I mentioned this Supreme Court case that is about whether or not you can require somebody to show good cause to get a license. Well, 25 states have now eliminated a license requirement altogether. And at least a dozen of those have happened just in the last few years. So what we're seeing is actually states are going in the opposite direction, not in the direction of what can we do to more strictly regulate guns, but what can we do to less strictly regulate guns. But in terms of states that are more strictly regulating guns and are seeing some success there, if you look at New York's gun homicide rates, they're actually very low for a place that has New York City within it. And so it has done a lot of comprehensive gun regulation. It's very hard to get a permit to carry a license in New York City, city of 8 million people, and there aren't more than a couple thousand licenses, I don't think. And I think the background check process to get a carry permit in New York City is something like 6 months long, where they allow up to 6 months to complete that process. So there are places that are doing that. California has a fairly low gun death rate compared to other places of its size. And it has kind of a comprehensive suite of regulations that all work together. And there's not kind of one here that's working better than others, but it's kind of a combination of these red flag laws. They have an unsafe handgun roster where they require any new sales of new handgun models to be examined by the state before they can be sold. Universal background check system, registration system for firearms. So there are places that are doing stricter regulation and are seeing some success. On the same side, there's a lot of other factors that go into states' gun death rate. So places like Wyoming and Idaho, they have really low gun homicide rates per capita even. But at least some of that's from a lack of huge city centers that some of these other bigger states have.
Got a couple of questions we didn't get to. People still asking questions about well-regulated militias. No one's saying they want to join one necessarily. Just curious how that's so separate from our modern context now. Mm-hmm. But also getting quite a few, and this is a favorite thing to do seemingly online, is a lot of people making the comparison to owning a vehicle mm-hmm. and a car. Obviously, vehicles weren't around when the Bill of Rights was penned, and so is that a legitimate? This is really, now I'm taking all these, and this is coming from me. Is that a legitimate point to bring up of how we require people to be licensed, to be tested, to be insured. Even as you were talking a moment ago, I thought you can't even rent a car. I think that this is still true, and maybe it's state by state, but you have to be 25 years old before you can even rent a car. And that has everything to do with your competency and your being emotional, your prefrontal cortex being ready for such a responsibility. Is that a legitimate, at your level, conversation point to make?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a fair comparison to make. I'll say that there are kind of 2 points that you would think about when you're thinking about the analogy, and a lot of it depends on which one you find kind of more persuasive. So in terms of the finding the analogy there, these are both, if not weapons, at least machinery that can cause severe harm, right? So we know that I think there are something like 40,000 car accident deaths a year. And there are about 40,000 gun deaths a year. 25 of those are suicides, are gun suicides. And so I may actually be off on the number of car accident deaths. Maybe it's actually way different. But regardless, there are at least a lot of car deaths each year, and there are a lot of gun deaths. And so, in that sense, allowing somebody to have access to something that can cause mass harm is, the point of similarity between those analogies. And so I think in that sense, yeah, there's a lot of things that make sense. We want somebody to be trained. We want somebody to be tested. We want someone to get periodic retesting. We want to make sure that there's qualifications that they have. We want to make sure that they're having insurance, so that if they do harm somebody, the other person's being compensated. One of the key disanalogies that some will point to is that driving is a privilege and that owning guns is a right. And so the way that we would deny somebody a driver's license if they didn't pass a driving test, or if we imposed more stringent requirements to somebody to get a driver's license, they're not going to have an argument that that's taking away a right of theirs. Whereas if we are going to make it too difficult for, say, your average person to get a gun license, then there are going to be the arguments that that takes away a right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So all we have to do is agree that driving's a right, and we'd be on the road to fixing that whole argument. Yeah, it's a right. I said so. Let's just all start saying it. Okay, well, we've got about 15 minutes left. You have given, as I expected you would, given us a ton of information, and I'm hoping there's been some note takers. And like I said, and if you're just joining us, we've recorded this conversation, so you can go back through and get maybe some of the questions that you have at this point answered by watching it again. Jake, could you give us some sort of simple steps maybe that we could take as you see it, and then resources? How can we deepen our understanding on these issues without having to, become students at Duke necessarily, so that we know a little bit more of what we're talking about? Because as you know, this conversation is completely overwhelmed with memes and anger and an inability to listen to other people if they are off brand, if they're on the other side of the aisle. We can't have those discussions. So could you help us with those two things?
Sure. So I think conversations like this are one of the best ways that we can push the conversations forward to constructive in constructive ways, because at the end of the day, whether you are a very strong Second Amendment absolutist or somebody who hates and wants to eliminate all guns, we all want the same end, which is a safer society. And we just disagree about what's best going to get us there. Is it everybody having guns, or is it nobody having guns? What's going to make us safer? And so recognizing that we're all agreeing on the same end-point and we're trying to get to that endpoint can actually make it a lot easier to have dialogue across the spectrum. I mean, in my position, I have conversations with a lot of people who I disagree with vehemently and who disagree with me vehemently. But I found that is kind of a common ground when we can talk about, all right, look, let's back up from this debate over an assault weapons ban and talk about what are we trying to achieve here and what's the best way to get there. So that's one thing. And then I think another thing is getting away from seeing it as pro Second Amendment or anti Second Amendment, because the Second Amendment, for two reasons. One, the Second Amendment is just not the primary obstacle. but also because it's not just you're for gun control or you're against it. There are a whole host of ways in which you can regulate guns, many of which are not going to affect law-abiding gun owners at all, right? Red flag laws, which are only about a person who a court has determined poses a risk to themselves or others. That's not affecting, enacting one of those laws is not going to affect a law-abiding gun owner or not. And then there can be debates about as you say, about banning an AR-15. Maybe you will talk to somebody who's an avid gun owner and they say, doing that is just symbolism, right? It's just banning a gun based on the fact that it looks scary. It's not doing anything if you're still allowing every other weapon that is functionally identical to be sold and used, and all you're doing is doing this one by name. So those kind of conversations, I think, can be helpful. In pushing the arguments forward and disaggregating what kind of we're thinking about when we're talking about this. Resources, there are a couple of places that I go to when I'm trying to figure out an issue. One of the best that has kind of a description of what laws there are and what the law allows and doesn't allow is Giffords Law Center. So this is one of the national gun violence prevention organizations. It was started by Gabby Giffords. And the Giffords organization just has on its website a huge amount of really easy to understand data. So you can just Google like Giffords and assault weapons, and it will tell you, here's the background on assault weapons, what they are, here's the summary of federal law, and here's the summary of state law. And it'll go through every state and say how it regulates. And it does that for ammunition, it does that for publicly carrying guns, it does that for guns in schools, and a whole bunch of other things. So I find that to be a really, really useful resource. And even for those who are hesitant to rely on a gun violence prevention organization, I have talked to many strong gun rights advocates who say they rely on Giffords because it has all of this information. You know, if you don't like the spin at the beginning, it still has all the information at the bottom. So that's one of the national organizations that's really good. And they also, as all these other organizations I'm going to mention, have stuff where people can volunteer and get involved and donate and be involved in writing letters and showing up places. So Giffords is one. Another major national organization is called Everytown for Gun Safety, and Everytown also has a lot of resources on its website about how things work, but also about how to get involved. And that's an organization that partners with Moms Demand Action. And so the Moms Demand Action and Student Demand Action chapters are affiliated with Everytown. And then kind of one of the other major national organizations is called Brady, or Brady United. And so that's one of the other major organizations that's doing advocacy work around gun violence prevention and trying to get new laws enacted. Here in North Carolina, we have a couple. We have an organization called North Carolinians Against Gun Violence. So North Carolinians Against Gun Violence. And Steve, if you don't have the websites, I can post a couple of these ones in. So North Carolinians Against Gun Violence is a state-based organization in North Carolina that does advocacy on behalf of gun violence prevention measures and has ways to get involved. As you probably suspect, the cities in North Carolina, the major cities, are the places where gun violence is concentrated. At least gun homicides are concentrated. Gun suicides tend to be the opposite. They tend to be in more rural areas and more older adults. But gun homicides tend to be concentrated in the urban areas in North Carolina and every other state. So Durham has a couple of organizations. There's one called Bull City United. And Bull City United is an organization that follows what's called the cure violence model. So it treats violence as a public health phenomenon, and it tries to cure it the same way you might try to cure a contagious disease. So it tries to cut off the vectors of transmission and stop those from spreading, because we know that a lot of the inner city violence is retaliatory violence that happens in cycles. And so this organization works with street outreach workers who are credible messengers in the community to try to stop those cycles of violence. And then another local one is the Religious Coalition for Nonviolent Durham, which is also an organization that works with religious and non-religious groups to find alternative ways of dealing with violence, dealing with conflict other than through violence. And they have an affiliation with the Restorative Justice Program that's run through the Religious Coalition that tries to deal with that kind of conflict outside of the criminal legal system as well. So those are a couple of organizations that I rely on and have followed and think highly of.
Great. So as you were talking, I have put all of those links to those websites in the chat. So if anybody was not watching the chat, you'll want to look in there and grab all those, put them in a place that you can get to them later. Jake, this is super helpful. That we didn't get to all the questions, and lots of the same kinds of questions. But one of the main things that I'm getting from people is they want to do something, but this feels super overwhelming, and the bad news comes so much more intensely and so much more voluminous than good news. Do you think change is happening? And I'm not asking you to perform hope for us, but I'm hearing something is shifting right now. Are you seeing that at your level?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's undeniable. So one of my colleagues at Duke, who's a political scientist, she wrote a book 20 years ago called "The Missing Movement for Gun Control in America," and her whole analysis was about the fact that why is there not a gun control movement that in the same way that there is a gun rights movement? Why has the NRA been effectively the only team on the field? And just a few years ago, she wrote a follow-up article to that, and was astonished to see that now there is almost a counterweight, right? Not exactly the same in funding, not exactly the same in number of membership, but there almost is a counterweight. So some of these organizations that I mentioned, and a lot of it started at the organizing from Sandy Hook, and then took off again with the organizing from Parkland. And I think we see that the next generation in poll after poll is reporting gun violence as one of their top electoral concerns. And it's beginning to be an issue on which those who are left of center are voting on in the same way that those who are right of center have long been voting on. And so, again, to the extent that that's something that you want to see happen, I think there are lots of reasons to be optimistic that the landscape is changing.
Yeah, great. Well, I wish that there were, here's the 3 things we can do this week, and then by next Wednesday sometime it'll be different. But I think everybody on this call is on it because they want so badly to do something. They want to make meaningful change. And so I just want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. I know there's a lot of other things we could be doing, and I know we're tired. It's middle of the week, but I want you to know it's not just me thanking you, but it's encouraging to me and to everybody on the call, for every one of you to be on here tonight, because this just isn't going to happen with each of us bemoaning and just feeling as sad as we all feel and as angry as we all feel. We're going to have to figure out a way to work together. And so to Jake's point, let's find ways to keep this conversation happening and keep finding ways to take steps together, because it would be really nice, to see some change soon. Jake, thank you so much for taking time. Your expertise on this has been invaluable, and I'm looking forward to not having to talk to you about this ever again.
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for all the great questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, everybody.